Bletchley Park, England. Winter of 1940. The rain fell in a slow, steady rhythm against the frost-stained windows of a quiet English estate. Inside, the air vibrated with the mechanical heartbeat of strange machines. Wheels turning, relays clicking, paper ribbons sliding out in endless streams of numbers and letters. Rows of young men and women worked in silence, their eyes red from sleepless nights, their fingers tracing patterns through chaos. There were no uniforms here, no medals, no roaring engines or gunfire, only the relentless pulse of thought. The unseen front line of a war fought not with bullets, but with logic. Each message intercepted from the ether carried the weight of thousands of lives. German orders, coordinates, convoys, secrets wrapped in an unbreakable cipher called enigma. The Germans believed their code was invincible, a perfect shield of mathematics and machinery. But deep within this mansion of whispers, a handful of minds had already begun to crack it. Germany's greatest weapon, its secrecy, was about to betray itself. The Enigma machine did not begin as a weapon of war. In the early 1920s, it was a commercial invention, a device built to protect corporate communications in a fragile post-war Europe. Its inventor, the German engineer Arthur Scherbius, saw it as a tool for bankers, diplomats, and businessmen who needed privacy in a world suddenly obsessed with espionage. But as Germany rearmed under the rising power of the Nazi regime, the military saw in Enigma something far more dangerous, a way to make their entire war machine invisible. By the mid-1930s, the Wehrmacht had transformed Scherbius's creation into the most complex cipher device the world had ever seen. The principle was simple in concept, but staggering in execution. At its core, Enigma used a series of rotating disks, or rotors, each with 26 electrical contacts representing the letters of the alphabet. When an operator pressed a key, the machine would substitute one letter for another through a maze of electrical paths, changing the pattern with each keystroke. Behind the rotors was a plug board, a panel of sockets and wires allowing further letter substitutions. Combined, these layers produced astronomical possibilities, over 150 quintillion different settings. Every midnight, German operators would change their daily key. Rotor order, plug board wiring, and starting positions, ensuring that yesterday's solution was useless today. It was, in every sense, a moving target. The Germans believed Enigma was mathematically unbreakable, and for a time, they were right. Early Allied cryptographers, from France, Britain, and the United States, tried desperately to make sense of the streams of gibberish radioed across Europe. They intercepted messages, recorded them, analyzed letter frequencies, and compared patterns. Nothing worked. The code was alive, shifting faster than any human mind could follow. In 1931, a small crack appeared. Hans Thilo Schmidt, a disillusioned German working at the cipher office in Berlin, sold key Enigma documents to French intelligence. Yet even with these materials, wiring diagrams, user manuals, setup sheets, the Allies couldn't break it. They lacked one thing: the machine's logic in motion. That missing piece would come, unexpectedly, from the Polish Cipher Bureau. Throughout the 1930s, Polish mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski worked in secrecy, using algebra and intercepted messages to reconstruct Enigma's internal wiring. In 1938, they even built a primitive mechanical replica, the world's first real step toward code-breaking automation. But as war loomed and Germany introduced new rotors, Poland's fragile advantage evaporated. Then came the sea. In 1940, the Battle of the Atlantic was raging. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, sinking Allied convoys with terrifying precision. Each submarine communicated with Berlin using Enigma, transmitting orders, reports, and positions under the illusion of perfect secrecy. But war is never perfect. In May 1941, British destroyers hunted down the U-boat U-110. During the attack, as the submarine began to sink, a boarding party led by Lieutenant David Balme risked their lives to enter the flooding wreck. Inside, among waterlogged charts and debris, they found something extraordinary: an intact Enigma machine and code books. It was the first major capture of its kind, and though few at the time realized it, that single act would alter the future of the war. From that moment on, the balance between secrecy and discovery began to shift. The Allies had the device, but now they needed the minds capable of understanding it. Minds that could turn raw intelligence into a weapon sharper than any sword. And in a quiet estate north of London, that work was about to begin. 50 miles north of London, surrounded by hedgerows and winter mist, stood an old Victorian mansion, Bletchley Park. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than an eccentric country estate, its gables crooked, its gardens overgrown. But by 1939, it had become the beating heart of Britain's most secret weapon, a fortress of intellect where the war would be fought in silence and secrecy. The British government, through the Government Code and Cipher School, GCNCS, had gathered the sharpest minds it could find. Mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and crossword enthusiasts, civilians, not soldiers, were recruited under vague invitations to serve in the national interest. Many had no idea what they were joining until the day they arrived. Among them was a quiet, eccentric mathematician from Cambridge, Alan Turing. Brilliant but socially withdrawn, Turing had already published groundbreaking work on theoretical machines, ideas that would one day form the foundation of computer science. But now, his theories were about to be tested against the most complex cipher in human history. Bletchley Park was organized like a miniature city, divided into wooden huts, each dedicated to a specific task. Hut 6 worked on decrypting German Army and Air Force traffic. Hut 8, under Turing and his colleague Gordon Welchman, focused on the naval enigma, the most critical and deadly, as it guided U-boats across the Atlantic. Other huts analyzed intelligence, translated messages, and transmitted reports to the military command under code names and cover letters. Inside these cramped rooms, the sound of clattering typewriters mixed with the hum of machines. Cigarette smoke curled through the air. The walls were lined with pinboards covered in letters, numbers, and colored strings connecting clues like veins of logic. But Bletchley didn't start from zero. Before the war, a quiet alliance had formed with Polish intelligence, whose mathematicians had spent years reconstructing the Enigma's design. In July 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland, the Polish Cipher Bureau met secretly with British and French representatives near Warsaw. There, they handed over everything they had: blueprints, notes, and a replica Enigma machine. That gift would become the cornerstone of the Allied code-breaking effort. Without it, Bletchley's war might never have begun. Still, the challenge was immense. The Germans kept changing their procedures, adding new rotors, new plugboard settings, new layers of complexity. Each modification multiplied the number of possible configurations by astronomical factors. By the time the war was in full swing, there were more than 150 trillion possible settings for each daily key. Turing's genius lay in turning the impossible into the mechanical. He designed a machine, the bomb bay, to simulate and test Enigma's countless combinations automatically. Dozens of bombes were soon running day and night, whirring through thousands of possibilities every second, guided by logic and intuition from their operators. But even with machinery, the task was grueling. Each decrypted message, each breakthrough, had to be confirmed, cross-referenced, and disguised. The Germans could never suspect their code had been broken. To keep the secret, Bletchley's success was known only to a handful of the highest-ranking officials, including Winston Churchill, who later called the Bletchley staff the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. While the codebreakers worked in silence, a vast intelligence network was forming across the Atlantic. British signals intercepts flowed to analysts in Washington, while U.S. cryptographers shared breakthroughs on Japanese and naval ciphers. By 1941, a transatlantic alliance of mathematicians, engineers, and spies was taking shape, the foundation of what would later become modern intelligence cooperation between the U.S. and U.K. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the German High Command remained confident. They trusted Enigma completely. They mocked Allied intelligence reports that hinted otherwise. To them, the idea that their most secure communications could be read by the enemy was not merely unlikely, it was absurd. Their ships, tanks, and planes moved according to orders encrypted on Enigma. Their generals discussed strategy over its circuits. Even Hitler's personal commands traveled through it. And all the while, in the dimly lit huts of Bletchley Park, those very messages were already being read, line by line, code by code. The invisible war of intelligence was about to collide with the visible war on land, sea, and air. The war at Bletchley Park was not fought with rifles or tanks. It was fought with pencils, paper, and silence. Inside the estate, nearly 10,000 people worked around the clock. Men and women, most in their early 20s, sworn to absolute secrecy. They lived double lives. By day, they took trains to office jobs in the countryside. By night, they broke the most sophisticated cipher system the world had ever seen. Each shift blurred into the next. The sound of typing never stopped. The rain outside seemed endless, seeping through the leaky hut roofs, pooling near the stoves that barely worked. They lived on tea and cigarettes, often too exhausted to speak, yet forbidden to tell anyone, not even family, what they were doing. One operator later recalled, "You didn't know what the message said. You just knew that somewhere someone might live or die because of it." They worked in fragments. One team intercepted signals. Another ran the machines. Another checked logic sequences. The complete picture, the meaning, was seen by only a few senior analysts. This division was deliberate. Secrecy even within secrecy. No one person could betray what they didn't fully know. Still, morale remained astonishingly high. Many felt a strange pride, a quiet sense that their unseen efforts mattered. They weren't on the front lines, but in a way, they were closer to the enemy than most soldiers ever would be. The machine that made it possible was Alan Turing's bomb, an elegant contradiction of engineering and intuition. Standing 7 feet tall and humming like an industrial organ, the bomb was designed not to decode messages directly, but to eliminate impossibilities. Each bomb bay contained dozens of spinning drums representing the Enigma's rotors. When fed with a crib, a probable word or phrase guessed to appear in a message, like Heil Hitler or Weather Report, the machine would churn through millions of potential rotor positions, ruling out those that made no logical sense. What remained, sometimes after hours of clattering computation, was a handful of possible Enigma settings for the day. From there, human analysts took over. They checked, tested, and confirmed. Turning machine guesses into human certainty was a primitive form of what would one day become computational warfare, machines, augmenting human reasoning to outthink an enemy's technology. Turing's method didn't just break a code, it changed how intelligence was done. It turned logic into a weapon. As the months passed, more bombies were built, each faster and more reliable than the last. By 1943, over 200 of them were running across Britain, in Bletchley and satellite stations, decoding tens of thousands of German messages every month. But even as Allied intelligence advanced into the electronic age, The enemy's confidence grew stronger. In Germany, Enigma was worshipped. To its operators, from U-boat captains to Luftwaffe officers, it represented perfection. Each transmission began with ritual precision. The officer would set the rotors according to the daily key, plug in cables across the board, type out his message, and listen as the machine clicked and flashed back nonsense. Beautiful nonsense. The coded text was transmitted in 5-letter groups, a rhythm that felt almost poetic in its symmetry. Every man who used Enigma was certain of its invulnerability. The mathematics seemed absolute. Even if the enemy captured the machine without knowing the rotor orders and plugboard settings that changed daily, it was useless. This arrogance was Germany's blind spot. They believed too strongly in their own system and underestimated the persistence of the minds working against them. When Enigma operators made small mistakes, repeating phrases, reusing message keys, or sending weather reports in predictable formats, they unknowingly handed Bletchley Park the tiny cracks it needed to pry open the whole system. The Germans also dismissed the idea that mathematicians could defeat them. In their worldview, wars were won by generals, not scholars. They saw encryption as a form of art, not science, a misjudgment that would cost them the Atlantic. And perhaps most fatally, they never imagined that the Allies could keep such a monumental secret. For years, the British read their messages, predicted their movements, and disrupted their operations, all while the Germans trusted Enigma completely. To the Axis powers, the front lines were visible. The deserts of North Africa, the skies above Europe, the icy Atlantic. To the Allies, the real battle was invisible, fought through static-filled radio signals and the relentless clicking of machines. Every decrypted message from Bletchley Park was a thread, pulled from Germany's web of secrecy. And with each thread removed, the web began to tear. The invisible war was becoming real. The human exhaustion, the whirring machines, and the arrogance of an enemy blinded by its own brilliance, all were converging toward a single truth. Enigma's myth of invincibility was crumbling. And soon, that collapse would change the course of every battlefield where Germany believed its messages were safe. At the very top of Britain's war command, only a handful of people knew what was really happening inside Bletchley Park. Among them was Winston Churchill. When he first learned of the work being done there, Churchill immediately grasped its magnitude. He recognized that this wasn't just code-breaking, it was intelligence at a scale never before imagined. He gave it a name that would echo through history: Ultra. Churchill personally protected Bletchley's operations with fanatical secrecy. He gave it top priority for manpower, funding, and resources, even when frontline units were desperate for supplies. To him, the people at Bletchley were the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. Their silence was everything. One word leaked, one careless mention, and the entire operation could collapse overnight. He ensured their work reached the highest levels of command through special courier systems, intelligence reports disguised, coded again, and circulated only under the name Ultra Secret. Even field generals never knew how the information was obtained. They simply received intelligence summaries, marked most confidential, unaware that every word had come from Germany's own encrypted communications. Churchill's leadership ensured that ultra-intelligence wasn't just read, it was used, but its use came with a burden few could bear. At Bletchley, knowledge was both power and torment. Operators often intercepted and decoded German orders detailing imminent attacks, convoys to be ambushed, cities to be bombed, ships to be sunk. Yet they couldn't always warn those in danger. Acting too often, too predictably, would reveal to the Germans that Enigma had been compromised. So, the codebreakers were forced to choose silence, even when they knew that silence meant death. A decoded message might reveal that a ship carrying hundreds of men would soon be attacked. But if the ship was warned, and the Germans noticed their coded orders had been countered, they would immediately change Enigma's settings, destroying months of progress and endangering future intelligence. One Bletchley veteran later admitted, "We sometimes knew exactly where a U-boat would strike, but we had to let it happen. It was a moral paradox no soldier on a battlefield could understand. In war, victory often requires sacrifice, but at Bletchley, those sacrifices were chosen with chilling calculation. The silence ate away at many who worked there. They couldn't share what they knew. They couldn't explain why certain tragedies had to unfold. Decades later, when the veil of secrecy was finally lifted, many confessed to lingering guilt, but history would vindicate them. Their restraint, painful as it was, saved far more lives than it cost. Their burden was invisible and absolute. While Bletchley Park's huts buzzed with silent genius, the intelligence they produced began to ripple across the world's battlefields. In the Atlantic, Ultra transformed the war against the U-boats. Each day, decrypted messages revealed where Germany's submarines were stationed, how they were coordinating wolf-pack attacks, and even the timing of refueling operations. Allied convoys began to change course before the U-boats ever arrived. Entire groups of submarines found themselves hunting in empty seas. In May 1943 alone, the same month Bletchley achieved peak efficiency with its naval decrypts, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, forcing Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his fleets from the North Atlantic. For the first time since 1939, Britain could breathe again. In North Africa, decoded Enigma messages provided details of Rommel's fuel shortages, supply convoys, and battle plans. British forces under Montgomery used that knowledge to time their offensives perfectly, most notably at El Alamein, where foreknowledge of Axis logistics helped secure one of the war's most decisive victories. In the air war over Europe, ultra-decrypts tracked Luftwaffe fighter deployments and radar coverage, giving Allied bombers the intelligence they needed to adjust routes and avoid traps. Everywhere Enigma was used, Ultra countered it, invisibly, precisely, relentlessly. But the brilliance of Bletchley's operation wasn't just in decoding, it was in concealment. The Allies had to ensure that the Germans never suspected their messages were being read. To maintain the illusion, British intelligence created cover, stories, false reconnaissance reports, fabricated spy networks, even staged lucky guesses, to explain how Allied forces seemed always to be in the right place at the right time. It was deception within deception, a war of shadows layered upon itself. And through it all, the Germans remained convinced that their code was unbreakable. Even as their convoys were ambushed, their submarines vanished, and their offensives failed. They blamed leaks, traitors, or mere coincidence. They never imagined that, in a quiet English mansion filled with typewriters and tea kettles, every one of their most secret words was being heard. By 1943, Ultra had become the single most valuable intelligence asset of the Allied war effort. Historians later estimated it shortened the war in Europe by as much as 2 years, saving millions of lives. Yet at the time, almost no one knew it existed. The men and women of Bletchley Park went home each night without medals, without recognition, and without the faintest idea that their invisible war had just altered the course of history. The tide was turning. But the true test, the moment when secrecy would meet strategy, was still to come. The Atlantic was the lifeline of the Allied war effort, and the Germans were determined to cut it. By 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a brutal, invisible siege. U-boats hunted Allied convoys across thousands of miles of open ocean, sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Every ship lost meant less fuel, less food, fewer weapons. Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. At the heart of that peril was naval enigma, the most advanced and closely guarded variant of the German code. It controlled the entire U-boat fleet, transmitting orders from Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters in occupied France to submarines prowling the North Atlantic. Breaking naval enigma became Bletchley Park's greatest challenge. Alan Turing and his team in Hut 8 devoted themselves to it relentlessly. They called the German network Shark, an apt name, for it was deadly, elusive, and silent. The Navy's version of Enigma had extra rotors, vastly increasing its complexity. Each time the British made progress, the Germans introduced new settings or security measures, throwing months of work into chaos. For a time, Britain was losing the war beneath the waves. Convoys were being massacred. The U-boats, traveling in coordinated wolf packs, attacked in the night, surfacing between freighters and firing torpedoes into the dark. Radio transmissions from these submarines, encrypted through Enigma, gave the Germans near-perfect coordination. The Allies, deaf to their communications, could only react after the damage was done. Then everything changed. Not through theory or calculation, but through courage. On May 9, 1941, the British destroyer HMS Bulldog, escorting a convoy southwest of Iceland, engaged the German submarine U-110. After a prolonged depth-charge attack, the U-boat was forced to surface. As it began to sink, Lieutenant David Baum led a boarding party into the half-flooded wreck. Inside, amid rising seawater and darkness, they found something priceless, a BD, complete Enigma machine, and a cache of codebooks, weather keys, and operating instructions. Against all odds, they retrieved them and escaped before the U-boat slipped beneath the waves. That single capture was one of the war's greatest intelligence victories. When the materials reached Bletchley Park, Turing and his team used them to reconstruct the German Navy's daily key. Within weeks, naval Enigma messages that had been unreadable for months began to pour in. For the first time, the Allies could see the U-boats, their positions, routes, and intentions in real time. The impact was immediate and devastating for Germany. Convoys began to divert just before ambushes. Allied aircraft patrolled U-boat transit lanes with uncanny precision. Whole wolf packs would arrive at rendezvous points to find only empty sea. By the winter of 1941, the hunters had become the hunted. But this was no simple victory. The Germans, suspicious of their losses, altered procedures, added rotors, and changed frequencies. Each adjustment plunged Bletchley back into darkness, sometimes for weeks. The work became a race against time, each breakthrough followed by another barrier. Turing responded with innovation. He refined the bomb design, introducing logical shortcuts to test rotor alignments faster. He collaborated with British engineer Gordon Welchman, who devised the diagonal board, a wiring method that multiplied the machine's efficiency. Together, they built an army of bombs, each one whirring day and night across Britain in sites from Bletchley to outstations in Staffordshire and Scotland. The human cost was immense. Analysts worked 12-hour shifts, sleeping on benches between runs, drinking black coffee to stay awake. Messages had to be decrypted, translated, analyzed, and passed to command, often within hours, before they lost tactical relevance. Every mistake, every missed intercept could cost ships and lives. Yet the results were undeniable. Between 1941 and 1943, as Enigma fell again and again, U-boat losses skyrocketed. By mid-1943, the Allies had turned the tide completely. That spring, Germany lost 41 submarines in a single month, a disaster from which its navy never recovered. Admiral Dönitz, unaware that his own communications had betrayed him, blamed luck, spies, and technical errors. He never suspected that every message he sent, every change in convoy route, every wolf pack order, was being read in real time by his enemies. The Battle of the Atlantic, once Germany's domain, had become a graveyard for U-boats. The sea that once carried death to Britain now carried its salvation, and beneath the surface of that triumph lay the hum of Turing's machines, the quiet rhythm of logic defeating chaos. But the greatest use of ultra-intelligence was yet to come. Soon, the same invisible network that saved Britain's convoys would determine the fate of Europe itself. By 1944, the Allied code-breaking network had become a weapon unlike any other, silent, unseen, and utterly decisive. The breakthroughs at Bletchley Park had evolved into Ultra, the code name for intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts. Every major Allied command now received Ultra reports, carefully filtered, disguised, and delivered under strictest secrecy. The men and women who read those pages knew they were holding the pulse of the enemy's mind, yet none could reveal where that knowledge came from. As the Western Allies prepared for their most ambitious operation, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, Ultra became their compass. The German High Command believed that Enigma was still secure. To them, Allied moves across the Mediterranean and Atlantic appeared disconnected, chaotic, even desperate. They had no idea that the Allies already knew the shape of their defenses, their troop deployments, their coastal fortifications. The deception began long before the landings. Using ultra-intercepts, the Allies learned exactly how German intelligence interpreted their actions, and then exploited those assumptions. They fed false reports through double agents, coordinated fake radio traffic, and staged entire divisions of inflatable tanks across the English countryside. Every false signal, every phantom army was designed for one purpose: to make Germany believe that the invasion would come not in Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais. And it worked, because Ultra made the illusion airtight. The codebreakers could read German reactions to the deception in real time, adjusting Allied tactics to maintain the ruse. By the time June arrived, Hitler had placed his strongest panzer divisions far from the true invasion point, convinced the main assault was still to come. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. In the early hours before dawn, Allied paratroopers dropped behind German lines. The largest armada in history moved across the English Channel, and as the beaches of Normandy erupted in fire and chaos, Bletchley Park's analysts were already reading the German High Command's confusion unfold minute by minute. Encrypted orders from coastal defenses revealed panic and fragmentation. Requests for reinforcements were delayed, misdirected, or ignored because ultra-fed intelligence had ensured the Germans' communication chains were overloaded. Even when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, realized the invasion's scale, it was too late. The reserve divisions he needed were still held near Calais, awaiting an attack that would never come. The deception had succeeded perfectly. But the brilliance of Ultra was not just in what it revealed. It was in when it was used. The Allies knew the Germans were reading certain Allied messages, so they allowed carefully crafted information to slip through those same channels. It was a deadly feedback loop of misinformation and manipulation, one that the Germans never escaped. In the weeks that followed, Bletchley's decrypts guided the Allied advance. Every German counterattack, every armored movement was anticipated. In some cases, Ultra allowed Allied bombers to strike headquarters hours before German orders could even reach the front lines. Historians would later call it the most decisive intelligence advantage in military history. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to believe in the infallibility of their machine. Even as their armies collapsed across France, They transmitted orders through enigma without hesitation. Hitler's generals argued over strategy, unaware that every word they exchanged was being recorded, translated, and placed on Churchill's desk by morning. For Germany, it was a war fought in blindness. For the Allies, it was a war fought with foresight. At Bletchley Park, the codebreakers never celebrated. They couldn't. Their work was invisible, their victories classified, their names unknown. Many would not speak of their roles for decades. But through their silence, they shaped the destiny of nations. The capture of U-110 and the brilliance of Turing's logic had led to this: the greatest deception in military history, the turning point of the war in Europe. By the end of 1944, the German war machine was unraveling. The Allies were advancing from Normandy toward Paris. The Soviets were pushing from the east, and Hitler's once unbreakable empire was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Still, the German High Command never realized the truth. Even in the final months of the war, they trusted enigma. They sent orders to phantom divisions, reports to commanders already dead, and requests for reinforcements that would never arrive. It wasn't until after Germany's surrender that captured officers learned what had happened. One interrogator later recalled their disbelief. They could not accept, he said, that the British had been reading their messages all along. The silent war was over. The greatest secret of the Second World War had remained intact, and it had changed the course of history. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, few outside a handful of locked rooms knew just how close the war had come to lasting years longer. Historians now estimate that Ultra shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years, saving potentially 14 to 20 million lives on all sides. The numbers tell the story. Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic fell dramatically after 1941, once U-boat wolf packs could be tracked and intercepted using decrypted messages. Convoys that once sailed blind now navigated with foresight, weaving through the ocean like pieces on a chessboard whose opponents' moves were known in advance. In North Africa, Ultra gave Montgomery the advantage against Rommel, predicting fuel shortages, supply routes, and even the timing of German offensives. In the air war, bombers were guided toward vulnerable industrial targets, while Luftwaffe ambushes were avoided altogether. And by D-Day, the full might of Allied intelligence, orchestrated from Bletchley Park, had transformed warfare itself. But none of this could be revealed. The power of Ultra did not end with victory. It depended on secrecy. Winston Churchill understood this more clearly than anyone. To him, Ultra was not only the greatest secret of the war, but a potential shield for the uncertain peace that would follow. Shortly after Germany's surrender, Churchill ordered that all references to Ultra, Enigma, and Bletchley Park be destroyed or concealed. In his words, "The geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled must never be allowed to cackle." Most of the machines were dismantled. Thousands of documents were classified under the Official Secrets Act. The very existence of the code-breaking operation was hidden even from members of Parliament. Many of the men and women who had worked at Bletchley returned to ordinary life. Clerks, teachers, engineers, their wartime brilliance sealed behind decades of silence. They couldn't tell their families what they had done. Even veterans' reunions passed without mention of the invisible war that had saved the world. Meanwhile, Britain quietly shared its code-breaking expertise with the United States, laying the foundations for a new intelligence alliance, one that would evolve into the Five Eyes network during the Cold War. Enigma decrypts had become Ultra. Ultra would become SIGINT, the backbone of modern signals intelligence. And yet, despite its global impact, Ultra remained unknown to the public. For decades after the war, history books credited victory to generals, tanks, and aircraft, the visible instruments of war. The quiet revolution that had unfolded in wooden huts outside London went unmentioned. But in those hidden archives, one truth remained undeniable. Every intercepted message, every decoded signal had changed the rhythm of the war. The Allies had not merely outfought Germany, they had outthought it. The power of enigma, once the symbol of German genius, had become its downfall. And still, the secret held firm. The men and women of Bletchley Park kept their oath of silence, guarding a truth that would not be declassified for more than 30 years. Churchill's order had been obeyed. The greatest secret of the Second World War would remain buried beneath the victory it had made possible. For the thousands who had labored in silence, within the confines of Bletchley Park, victory brought no parades, no medals, and no recognition. When peace returned, the gates closed quietly behind them. Some went back to universities, others to civil service or teaching. Many never spoke of their wartime work again. Husbands and wives who had both served there sometimes lived entire lives without realizing they had once sat in neighboring huts, decoding history. Alan Turing, whose logical brilliance had laid the foundation for modern computing, found himself adrift in a world unready for him. His wartime achievements were still classified, hidden even from those who might have celebrated him. Yet his post-war research, the design of the automatic computing engine, ACE, built directly upon the ideas that had cracked Enigma. The machines that once broke ciphers became the ancestors of digital computers. The silent war of Bletchley Park had given birth to the information age. Meanwhile, the secrecy surrounding Ultra persisted. For decades, German generals wrote memoirs describing how they had been outmaneuvered or betrayed by fate, never realizing that their every move had been known in advance. They wondered how Allied convoys always evaded their U-boats, how Luftwaffe squadrons were ambushed before takeoff, how D-Day's deception worked so flawlessly. None suspected the truth. Their own messages had been their undoing. Even into the 1950s, Enigma machines were still being sold to other nations by Britain. Former Axis and new post-colonial governments alike bought them, unaware that British and American intelligence could still read every transmission. The codebreakers' legacy continued, quietly fueling a new kind of global surveillance. When the secret of Ultra was finally declassified in the 1970s, the revelation astonished the world. Veterans in their 70s opened newspapers and saw headlines describing the war they had fought for the first time. Historians rewrote entire chapters of the conflict. Battles once thought to be determined by luck were now understood as the result of hidden insight. The ghosts of Bletchley were finally recognized as the unseen architects of victory. Yet for many, it was too late. Turing had died 2 decades earlier. Countless others had passed away in silence, never knowing the gratitude history owed them. Their families learned the truth not from their own lips, but from documentaries and government releases. Still, the legacy of their work endures, not only in computers, encryption, and intelligence networks, but in a profound lesson about human resilience. In a war dominated by weapons and destruction, it was thought, pure, relentless thought, that turned the tide. The Enigma had been built on the belief that human intellect could be surpassed by machinery. Bletchley Park proved the opposite, that machines could only be as powerful as the minds guiding them. When the last Enigma was silenced and the last code cracked, Germany's military power collapsed, not only on the battlefield, but in the realm it believed unassailable, its secrets. The Allies had won not just through might, but through mastery of knowledge. And in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park, long after the rain had stopped and the machines had gone still, that victory remained unspoken, a triumph carved in silence. In every war, courage is measured by the noise it makes. The thunder of artillery, the roar of engines, the cheers of victory. But at Bletchley Park, courage took a different form. It lived in silence. It spoke through concentration, through exhaustion, through minds that refused to yield to impossibility. The people who worked there fought an invisible war, a war not for glory, but for truth. Their battlefield was thought, their weapon, understanding. They faced an enemy they would never meet and defeated it without ever firing a shot. In doing so, they changed the meaning of warfare forever. For the first time in history, information became more decisive than ammunition. The great battles of the future, in cyber networks, satellites, and algorithms, were born from those rooms of ticking rotors and restless minds. Every encryption system, every computer, every intelligence agency that exists today traces its lineage back to that hidden estate in Buckinghamshire. Bletchley Park was not just a place, it was a promise. That intellect could overcome violence, that persistence could overcome arrogance, that silence, when driven by purpose, could echo louder than any bomb. And perhaps most powerfully, it revealed the paradox of victory. That sometimes, to save lives, one must remain unseen and unheard. Those who broke Enigma carried that weight quietly to their graves, knowing that their silence had bought peace for millions. History now remembers them not for what they said, but for what they kept secret. Not for what they destroyed, but for what they preserved. And through it all, the lesson remains unshakable, timeless, and quietly profound. Wars may begin with force, but they are won by those who understand. Because in the end, Germany never knew the Allies were reading every message they sent.